Hello everybody, you're watching World 360 on CNN News 18. I am Aisha Varma. Over the next half an hour, we'll get you all of the major international stories of the week. We're going to be talking about the latest in the Russia-Ukraine war, whether Sri Lanka succumbed to pressure from China, and we'll also get you an update on the China-Taiwan tension. But before that deep dive, here's a look at the headlines. Fears of a nuclear disaster are looming as shelling takes place at Europe's largest nuclear plant. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky holds a three-way meeting with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and Turkey's President Erdogan in Lviv. Sri Lanka allowed China's spy ship, the Yuanwang 5, to dock at Hambantota port this week despite protests from India. The Ministry of External Affairs says it is closely monitoring any development that has a bearing on India's security. As the United States and Taiwan announced formal trade talks, Chinese warplanes and Navy ships were tracked around the Taiwan Strait. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky met with United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres and Turkey's President Erdogan in Ukraine's western city of Lviv earlier this week. Now, the three talked Russia, and Erdogan warned of another Chernobyl, a reference to the recent shelling on Europe's biggest nuclear power plant, which is located in Ukraine at Zaporizhzhia. Now, these attacks have fueled fears of a nuclear disaster. Now, beyond this, the United States Pentagon has announced a new $775 million aid package for Ukraine, and it includes additional ammunition and weapons to combat Russia's invasion. We now have CNN's Sam Kiley joining us from Zaporizhzhia. Sam, is the situation at Ukraine's nuclear plant likely to become catastrophic like Chernobyl?
That certainly is the view of the President of Turkey, Mr. Erdogan, but also the United Nations have said that any kind of an attack there could be suicidal, and that there is deep concern here in Ukraine among the authorities that their own population, obviously, were the nuclear power station to suffer some kind of technical fault or military attack, would be vulnerable. They could be vulnerable from relatively low-level contamination right through to the catastrophe of a meltdown. All of that would depend on what would happen to the nuclear power station. Now, it is the it is the biggest in Western Europe. Not all of its 6 reactors are functioning at the moment, but the essential thing is that the cooling systems that keep those reactors under control cannot be interfered with. They could be interfered with by a military attack, but they could also suffer some kind of power loss, either from the main supply that comes in from the other parts of Ukraine, right through to some kind of loss of backup supplies. The backup cooling systems, for example, depend on diesel generators. If the diesel doesn't get to those generators, then something disastrous could happen. So the opportunities for catastrophe exist, which is why the international community, and indeed the Russians and Ukrainians in their very different ways, are so seized of this issue and so anxious about it.
All right, Sam. Now, what's the temperature among the G20 nations ahead of the meet in November? Because Putin will be attending the G20, and Zelensky has been invited as well.
There's a great deal of time to be passed between now and November, particularly given the scale of the war here in Ukraine and the stakes that the international community are seeing in play. Now, whether or not Vladimir Putin actually turns up, whether he would want to risk exposing himself to pretty widespread condemnation would be very interesting to see. Clearly, there is a slighter degree of more kind of not quite warmth, but not quite support, but not total condemnation coming towards Russia from China. But at the same time, the international atmosphere at the G20 is going to be, broadly speaking, very anti-Russia's policy of invading Ukraine, causing catastrophic levels of fuel price increases around the world, potentially very severe international instability in the food markets, and the ramifications of what is happening here in Ukraine were known at the last G20 meeting and have only got more intense and more problematic. So it would by no means be somewhere that Vladimir Putin would have an easy time of it if indeed he did turn up. And he would definitely perhaps not want to be in the same location in which he is being eclipsed by his neighbouring president, Mr. Zelensky, who, whilst he is enduring a war against his country, is enjoying considerable international celebrity and support, and is not shy as a professional actor of knowing how to use that international celebrity and support to best expose his opposing president to international opprobrium.
All right, Sam Kiley, thank you so much for joining us and bringing us those details. Now, moving on, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar once again addressed criticism about India importing Russian crude oil, saying that people can't afford higher energy prices and that it's his moral duty to ensure the best deal for his country. Now, he also said that the world has somewhat accepted New Delhi's position on buying Russian oil amid Moscow's ongoing war in Ukraine, because New Delhi has not been defensive about its decision. Listen in.
At this time, oil prices are unreasonably high. We have been very open and very honest about our interest. You know, I have a country which has a per capita income of $2,000. These are not people who can afford higher energy prices. It is my obligation, my moral duty, to actually ensure that I get them the best deal that I can from the world.
Now, after a lot of back and forth, Chinese spy ship Yuanwang 5 finally docked at Sri Lanka's Hambantota port earlier this week. Now, this ship has several high-tech capabilities, including sensors that can track India's ballistic missiles if they are tested. Now, India had already raised concerns over the ship and at the same time continued to provide assistance to Sri Lanka. Now, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar said that the MEA is monitoring whatever happens in our neighborhood, especially any developments that have a bearing on India's security. The ship is slated to leave the Hambantota port on the 22nd of August. All right, now India's former ambassador to China, Mr. Ashok Kanta, is joining us to get us perspective on this story. Mr. Kanta, could you explain why Sri Lanka buckled under pressure from China to let their ship dock?
You know, first we need to understand the nature of this visit by Chinese vessel to Hambantota port. It's not a routine visit. It's a highly advanced satellite and ballistic missile monitoring vessel, which was visiting Sri Lanka. In fact, such a visit was taking place for the first time since 2014. So it had, serious implications for us. It was not a routine visit. That's one point I wanted to make. As to why Sri Lanka, allowed this vessel to dock at Hambantota port, we can only, guess the reasons behind that. If you look at the statement issued by Ministry of Foreign Affairs Sri Lanka, they have given the background, and they have also explained that the permission was first given on 12th July, which you'll recall was a period of political flux in Sri Lanka. Subsequently, they asked China to defer docking of the vessel, which Chinese did for some time, but eventually permission was given. One needs to understand that Chinese presence and influence in Sri Lanka is well entrenched. This is an objective reality. Sri Lanka has extensive, engagement with China, including in the defense and security domain. You're aware of the fact that important facilities like Hambantota port have been given to Sri Lankan entities on long-term 99-year lease. Even earlier, there were concerns in Sri Lanka about Port City project when President Mahinda Rajapaksa was in power. These misgivings were expressed by people like Maithripala Sirisena and Ranil Wickremesinghe, who subsequently came to office. But at that time also, they succumbed to pressure from Sri Lanka and allowed the Port City project. Not only that, they also handed over Hambantota port on a long-term lease. So there's a background that we have to bear in mind. There's an objective reality of Chinese influence and presence in Sri Lanka that we have to factor in our dealings with Sri Lanka.
All right, now, Mr. Kantha, how do you think this bodes for India's ties with Sri Lanka?
I don't think, it will have any seriously negative impact on India's relations with Sri Lanka, which are close and multidimensional. You're aware of the fact how much we have intervened as the first responder, under circumstances of unprecedented political and economic crisis faced by Sri Lanka, kind of assistance we have provided to Sri Lanka. We have, engagement with Sri Lanka cutting across various domains, from civilizational linkages to economic connect to societal linkages to, economic and strategic interactions. I think that is something which will continue undisturbed. We have noticed remarks made by President Ranil Wickremesinghe in his interview to The Economist that India and Sri Lanka have a special relationship and that two countries must take into account each other's interests. We hope that our Sri Lankan friends will walk the talk. We need to step up our dialogue and communication with Sri Lanka on security issues, underline the point that security interests of India and Sri Lanka are closely intertwined. In the past, on several occasions, the Sri Lankan side has taken on board our concerns. You'll recall that in 2014, a Chinese submarine had visited Colombo port. At that time, we had expressed our misgivings, and subsequently, Sri Lanka has not allowed Chinese submarines to visit ports in Sri Lanka, even though we understand that China had made such an attempt in 2017, but the request was turned down. So I hope that the Sri Lankan side will take into account our legitimate security concerns, and this will be a one-off visit rather than something becoming routine. But we should not take that for granted. As I mentioned earlier, Chinese presence and influence in Sri Lanka is well entrenched, and we need to step up our own act when it comes to dealing with Sri Lanka and see that our concerns and interests are preserved in that country.
All right, Mr. Ashok Kantha, thank you so much for joining us and speaking to us about this topic. Now, what we're going to do now is take a look at why the Chinese spy ship is such a threat to India. Now, essentially, the first point is that the Yuanwang 5 is a latest generation space tracking ship, and it's operated by the Strategic Support Force of the PLA. Now, apart from this, it can monitor satellite, rocket, and intercontinental ballistic missile launches. It also has an aerial reach of more than 750 kilometers, and due to India's proximity, this means that our nuclear facilities can be spied on. Now, specifically, several southern areas can be snooped upon. Now, these include ports that are located in Chennai and Thoothukudi. Now, in total, there are 6 southern ports in 3 cities under its radar, specifically in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and Andhra Pradesh. And India is worried because the port where the ship has docked, Hambantota Port, is right in India's backyard. Now, shifting focus, the United States Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan on the 2nd of August, and the ripple effects of that visit still continue. The United States and Taiwan have officially announced bilateral trade talks, and negotiations will cover a range of items, including, but not limited to, good regulatory practices, anti-corruption, and non-market policies as well. Now, the information coming in is that Taiwan has tracked 21 warplanes and 5 naval ships from China around the country, with 8 jets crossing the Taiwan Strait median line. Now, for the people in Taiwan, decades of living under the threat of a Chinese invasion have made them perceive the risk differently from outside observers. Here's a ground report from CNN's Blake Essig.
Twice this month, U.S. congressional delegations, one of them led by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, visited Taipei. Their goal, to reaffirm U.S. support for Taiwan and help ease cross-strait tensions. Although the U.S. delegations came and went, Beijing responded by condemning the visits and flexing its military muscle, while the people of Taiwan were left to deal with the consequences.
We kind of expected cross-strait tension to be escalated because of their visits. I don't think the visits are helping Taiwan.
I think it was selfish of Pelosi to visit Taiwan.
Since there is the Taiwan Relations Act, maybe they are visiting to reassure us that they stand with us. I don't think they provoked China. After all, threats from China never stop.
Despite the constant threat of a forceful reunification from China, take a look around. Life here continues. The shopping district is packed. Restaurants are full, and while some people are concerned, the mood here is surprisingly calm.
We can't rule out the possibility of them to attack Taiwan.
Being worried isn't helpful.
I don't think China dares to really attack Taiwan. They're just posturing to enhance cohesion domestically.
Although there's a quiet confidence that Taiwan's military would be able to hold off a Chinese invasion,
Taiwan's military has regular exercises, and I have faith in them.
if war does break out, there are many people here who say that they'll do whatever they can to help fight for their island, whether that's by taking up arms or learning to provide first aid.
Which is why civil defense courses like this are being held and why this class is full.
There's no delusion about the threat that we face. However, we're remaining calm because this is the reality that we've lived under for so many years. But it's when I see folks turning out for events like this one, I know that while we're not running around panicked that PLA might attack tomorrow, we all know that we can do more and we must do more to help preserve the peace.
I believe the better our preparation is, the less chance the war will be, because our rival will not win easily, and it is important to show them that we are prepared.
Peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, a concept that people here tell me seems more unlikely with each passing day, as tensions between China and Taiwan show no signs of improving.
Now, with that, we're heading into a very short break, but stay tuned to learn about some more interesting stories when we come back.
A vote was brought